Welcome back everyone to YellowCard Vanguard. Zystral and Toku here today with another episode of our breakdown series. Title's still in progress. If you have any better suggestions, let us know. But we're going to be sticking on with VPremium and looking at a different matchup today, which is going to be Thavas versus Jewel Knights. So in the first episode of the series, we looked at Glendios versus Steam Maiden, which is the big bad in the meta, being Steam Maiden, being tier 0, versus Glendios, which is its natural counter. Whereas here today, we're looking at maybe more lower down the levels, high tier 2, low tier 1, seeing what else people might play, might bring as a pet deck to BCS or potentially even Worlds. We've got Thavas and Jewel Knights as mentioned, and the thing with Thavas here is that in an opposite paradigm to what we had with Glendios versus Steam Maidens, neither of these decks are really top dog anymore. Thavas still sees a little bit of play because it still saw some wins at BCS, some top cuts, but nothing too impressive. And it's kind of fallen off the radar despite still being a pretty solid deck, as compared to, say, Jewel Knights, which has been less common in the metagame, but arguably better positioned.
What's really cool to note about Jewel Knights is that they've got support 3 out of the last 4 sets now. They got it in Clan Selection, they got it in Clan Collections 3 and 4, and as well as now with the release of Ashley Reversing Friends 5 and 6. So now having 3 different sets of support, one of the things that you'll actually see right now in this clip is we now have 12 different grade 1s that we do not mind riding into because they all do something similar when rode upon, and that is cycle itself out. So you can see myself here doing basically, when you think of Jewel Knights, a lot of people think about just like, oh, having the effects on ride and being able to ride over them to be able to get effects. But there's more to Jewel Knights than just that. And as you can see here, right now I'm doing a lot of cycling, a lot of filtering, a lot of soul charging through the use of Eunice, through the use of Alwyn, just to be able to try and dig for pieces that I'm missing. In particular, what I was looking for here was Ashley Reverse.
Yeah, and the main thing to note about Jewel Knights is that, kind of like with OTT and Premium, when so many of the cards in your deck say you get to go again, try again, that gives you a lot of room to be aggro in the early game, which a lot of decks surprisingly don't deal with well in VPremium. So here, Toku's early game wasn't too insane. He did, as you say, basically recycle a bunch of grade 1s over each other. But the fact that he was able to get that deck velocity, that deck speed, and eventually start building up some compression and getting closer to his big combo goes from more of a rush style, more into a ticking time bomb, to a point where Ashley Reverse is going to be huge, unguardable, winning the game. Especially into a matchup like Thavas, which one of the strengths of Thavas is its flexibility and its sort of dynamicness, right? If it needs to, it can tank up, play it slow, draw a bunch of cards, build up Axel markers, and then grind you out with really big pursuit assaults. Or it can try and push early aggressively, get the multi-attack combos, get everything it needs, and then from there be able to go into its Adelaides, its early pursuits, and just go for game as soon as it can. And that back and forth, the dichotomy, is what sort of gives it quote-unquote control of the game, in that it chooses how it wants to play. But if you take that away from it, that depends a lot on, does it draw the pursuit assaults? If it's trying to play aggro, does it draw the Adelaides and the whatever else, the wheel assaults? Or if you're trying to play it slow and play draw, do you find the coral assaults? Do you find your Narissas? Compared to Jewel Knights, which is just, whatever I have in my hand at the moment, I'm just going to throw at your face.
Yeah, exactly. So Jewel Knights does play similarly to like a roguelike, so to say, where you play with what you have and you play towards what you have. So I want to also point out that basically what I did in the early game by just going through my deck with a lot of soul charges, a lot of cycling, is that your starting deck is the least trigger compressed it will be. So the chances of myself soul charging the triggers at this stage of the game was the smallest it could be. So in the early game, I think it's best to soul charge as much as you can. That way, once you get to the later stages of the game, your trigger compression will reward you later. And I do want to point out something on this turn here. When I did have the Ashley, I actually did get a little bit lost in the sauce, so to speak. I focused too hard on Eunice being able to +1 back to hand that I kind of didn't really notice the fact that Ben had 2 wheel assaults in the back in the same column as my Eunices. So on this turn, I could have actually used the Ashley Vanguard skill to call over both of my Eunices to snipe both of the pieces. It doesn't come up big in this upcoming turn, but it does lean towards Ben's favor in the far future. The extra 10k in hand from Eunice doesn't really amount to the amount of pressure and offensive pressure that the 2 wheel assaults in the back does. So something like here where I was going to be able to actually get rid of Ben's multi-attack combos through the use of wheel assault and such was probably a better usage of my Eunice.
Yeah, the main thing to note here about Thavas is that, like I mentioned before, the deck is very piece reliant. Here we see that I had both my wheel assaults on turn 3, and I have pursuit assaults, and I've only got 1 Narissa and no corals, which means I'm going for an aggro sort of game plan here, trying to push him as much damage as I can, especially because he's guarded early and he's currently on 0 damage, and the ability to do that obviously relies on me having all of my combo pieces ready and available. And here, by not disrupting the wheel assaults, the double wheel assault is part of the quote-unquote full combo of Thavas. So by not removing those, he's sort of, rather than forcing me to play into the draw power of coral assaults and the Narissas, which I might not have, by letting me keep the wheel assaults, he's saying that, okay, you can either go for the draw engine, like with the corals, or if you have them, cool down 2 pursuits and Adelaide, and I might take like 3 or 4 damage this time.
And yeah, I think that's another thing as an addendum is how heavily I guarded in the early game, because one of my main things about VPremium is that without the threat of an overtrigger, you can no pass on a lot of swings, or even 1-2 pass, because like I said, in the early game, that's when both you and your opponent's deck will be the least thinned out, so lower chance of getting the trigger. So 1-2 passes in the early game is fairly economical, so to say, because as you can see, once we hit these points, these are really high attacks with like the pursuit assaults being scaled up, the triple drives being able to get more than 1 trigger onto rear guard attacks. So myself having guarded early, very early in the early game, having a lot of cards that actually cycle themselves out, I was able to get a lot of plus-minus zeros here, which let me take a lot of the damage that could have been lethal already on this upcoming turn.
Yeah, so even though I wasn't able to equalize the damage, you see here that even though he was able to take a bunch of attacks, there was the defensive let him 1 card guard a lot of them, but that's still a bunch of cards that he ends up having to guard with. And so I sort of evened out on board parity in a way. And here, missing the Ashley reverse rewrite was really damaging. It means that he loses a lot of lethality pressure, and it turns that sort of, 60, 70k to crit Vanguard swing that I literally cannot guard or have to pray to heal on into a bunch of 10 to 20k pokes that I can now also 1 card guard.
The bigger thing about missing the Ashley reverse here as well is I'm unable to actually get rid of the pursuit assaults now, because they scale both on your turn as well as my turn based on the Axel markers that you get. So these are now 19k bodies that I either have to waste a swing at if I want to get rid of, and because they get larger defensively as well, it's easier for you to guard. So that's why I'm sending most of my attacks into the Vanguard. If I was able to ride into the Ashley reverse, I would have been able to use her effects to remove those, which would then soften the offensive pressure you'd be able to put out the turn next. And once again, just like what I said before on my first turn at grade 3, despite having 3 Eunices in hand, being able to put them in the same columns as your wheel assaults, I decided to go for the 10k plus into hand rather than being able to take the wheel assaults off the board, which would have saved me from 1 attack, which would have been more than 10k's worth in hand.
Yeah, I mean, the Eunices can also have retired the pursuit assaults as well, which is fairly relevant. Here, I'm burning the PGs because I won't be able to use them if you do find the Ashley reverse. What's worth noting is that even though I mentioned how Thavas is the combo deck here, because Jewel Knight isn't as quote-unquote reliant on its pieces, the difference here is that your pieces have almost not limited effectiveness in a way, but once you do the combo, once you commit, you kind of need to see more of them to keep the chain going. Whereas in the case of Thavas, the moment an Adelaide or a Pursuit comes down, if you don't deal with it, they're going to sit there and continue to, quote-unquote, push the envelope on you every single turn.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, push the envelope. I think one of the main things here is that Jewel Knights does have an awkward attack order in the sense that to get the most out of multi-attack, you have to attack with Ashley last to call over your 2 front rows, in which case you don't really have great targets to actually give trigger power to. So it turns out that I was out of all of my Mirandas in deck, so I had to go for a double rail. Otherwise, that 10k that I got on the initial Ashley swing, I could have pseudo-donated to Miranda through her effect. But instead here, once again, I decided to use the Eunice skill to bounce itself back to hand rather than... One of the main things I want you guys to learn from my mistakes here is that Eunice has more than one effect. And sometimes you need to figure out, is that 10k in hand worth more than being able to remove a key combo piece off the board. Because pretend that I was able to remove that Wheel Assault the turn prior. Pretend I was able to remove the Wheel Assault on this turn. Despite not being able to go into Astral Reverse, I would have been able to pick at Ben's board. I would have been able to stabilize a lot of my hand on this upcoming turn, where I wouldn't have to deal with 1 or 2 extra attacks off of the double Wheel Assault combo.
Yeah, like we said before, once Thavas commits its pieces, every single piece continues to provide value, and here we're seeing that in full force. You know, I've got the double Pursuit, I've got an Adelaide, I've 2 Adelaides, double Wheel Assault. You know, this is now going to be the quote-unquote ceiling of what Thavas is capable of in an offensive turn, and you've already taken some damage. You can still take 1 or 2 more attacks and bank on 1 or 2 more defensives, but it does become a lot harder for you to, say, grind this out the way I would try and grind this out.
Yeah, indeed. And I also want to point out that I definitely made some blunders with guarding in this game. Both of the Adelaides here, if I was to take one and then get a defensive trigger on it, the second one would have been a whiff. And myself knowing that I'm going to be taking damage anyways this turn, I should have taken the first Adelaide, because if there's a defensive trigger on top, then that effectively guards the next Adelaide, and then it'll help to guard in the future turns instead. But because myself seeing that, oh, these are such easy cards to attack right now, and the future Pursuit Assaults will be a bit harder, I was thinking that maybe I should take the Pursuit Assault, but no. In this instance, if a defensive trigger would have been able to guard the next Adelaide, and I know that I would have to take a damage regardless, I should have taken the first Adelaide and then decided to guard the next after.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, a thing I want to draw attention to here is, if you rewind the video like 2 or 3 minutes, take a look at the size of my hand across turns. You always see that at the beginning of my turn, my hand size is decent but not amazing. It dwindles to almost nothing, and then at the end of the turn it always comes back up again, easy for me to guard. This is exactly what I mean when I say that Thavas is a very dynamic deck, and I think that this is one of the big factors that contributes to why we saw so much of it at BCS, despite not actually being a tier 1 deck.
Yeah, having all of these like grade 2s as well as grade 1s, namely the Corals, namely the Narissas, being able to get good value out of them on their attacks. Coral being a 24k beater, that's magic numbers against every clan in the game right now, but also being able to cycle itself out. If your hand is weak, you can cycle itself out for maybe like a new attacker on the next turn, or if you're looking for more combo pieces, or if your hand is strong enough, you can actually leave it on board for a 5k shield, and then it once again, like you said, it pushes the envelope. This is something that has to be dealt with, otherwise it's going to be another 24k attacker on your next turn.
Yeah, and just like that, you know, the crit comes down. Your hand is decent, but in terms of the number of attacks versus the power, this matchup is a case of 2 different types of scaling. I've got more attacks, you've got bigger numbers, both of them are equally hard to guard.
So we're going to jump fast forward here into a middle of a game where Ben was actually able to get like a very good early game, being able to find all of the different cyclers out. We've got Narissas, we've got Coral Assaults, got a Pursuit in the back that we were able to use its skill to draw out of as well. I did luckily get a defensive trigger here, so I should be able to guard most of these, but this is still a lot that I have to deal with.
Yeah, notice how my hand goes from like 2 cards right now. Yeah, you've got the triple dive from the Thavas, you've got like draw 3 or 4 from the rear guards on the board, and by leaving the board empty, I force him to attack into me with all of his bodies, so that way he doesn't have the option of controlling my board. If he wants to retire the Pursuit Assault in the back row, he needs to commit a Eunice to do it. And in doing that, I can put myself in a position where I can heal out, he might not, he might waste his heal triggers, and from there, I get a lot more value. But in this case, he gets the defensive heal, and I'm still going to be on pretty low damage going into his turn. The full grip you can see there just means that I can do whatever the hell I want. Even if he first rides Ashley Reverse, it's of no threat to me because I should be able to guard it, or just no guard because he's only on 2 damage. And his overall turn becomes one where he has to play the turtle up defensive, draw a lot of cards game plan, which Jewel Knight is much less adept at.
Mm-hmm. To draw a lot of cards, you basically need to be calling over your grade 1s to find those extra cards. That is where your plussing comes from. So what Ashley Reverse is good at now is that you're able to turn nothing into a lot. So I commit 1 card from my hand, being the Morvidus. Actually, I don't even commit it from hand. This was the Morvidus that I cheated off of the Civil Ride. And I'm able to then convert that 1 ride over bonus into a full board. And with that full board, I'm kind of able to just kind of like work my resources into it. But the main thing here to note is that Ben's front row has disappeared. So while I'm still plussing 1 each time I Soul Blast 2 and lock one of my rear guards to make another rear guard, I'm not plussing 2 in the sense that I'm negating Ben 1 at the same time I do this.
Yeah, it's also worth mentioning that calling bodies to the board just to fuel bodies onto the board is what we call a soft plus, whereas me straight up drawing cards is a hard plus. I'm sure we made a cram school video about it like 2 or 3 years ago, linked it in the corner. I'm sure one of us will do that. But it's none of these are all cards that he's calling that he's not going to be able to guard with. So when I inevitably survive this turn, he still has to work pretty hard to survive my onslaught.
Yeah.
Whereas all those cards I've drawn, I can guard his rear guard attacks a lot more easily and still maintain combo pieces if I decide to no guard, or if I somehow drew into like 2 or 3 triggers, that turns his vanguard attack into like a 2 or 3 pass. That's a lot less stress on me and my combo pieces than it is on him.
Yeah, so to say, basically, the cards that I have to guard Ben's next turn with are the cards I already had. Whereas with Ben being able to cycle out his entire board for a new hand, the cards that he's able to guard with and the cards that he's able to decide to call in the next turn, he has full knowledge of.
The thing I will mention about this particular turn is that by finding the Miranda, it gives you all the sort of quote-unquote scaling you need to have that aggressive game plan. And the thing about, again, scaling is that because of Ashley Reverse's guard restrict, the game will eventually reach a point where I can't guard all of your attacks. Even though you can't guard all of mine, your attack is inherently more lethal because it's a Vanguard drive check with crit on it, whereas all of my attacks are only ever 1 or 2 pokes of damage at a time.
Like you said way at the beginning, like this Jewel Knights is a ticking time bomb of a deck. It thins very aggressively with all of its superior calls. It thins aggressively in the early game with all of its soul charging as well. So in a sense that like eventually I will get to the breaking point where I might even go for like a 4-lock and go for like a definitely you cannot PG this, you probably cannot guard from hand either. And despite yourself having drawn that many cards, 1 off the extra exile at the end of turn, 4 off of the cycles, this was still a no guard for you. Luckily though, because that you were able to get a lot of hand, you were able to guard the prior attacks, which means that this was a safe no guard.
Here we can PG the Melissa attacks, so again the pressure there is lost, being able to find them. I'm still in the game, but I'm still suffering a massive damage deficit. But what we're seeing here is that I've generated so much soul from all of these in-soul plussing units that I can spam it all on Pursuit Assaults and Narissas and generate these huge numbers, and sort of playing his own game where I'm hitting him with 30k, 40k numbers that he's now struggling to guard with, on top of having more attacks and pokes than he's used to.
Yeah, so like I said, because I didn't really get any plushing to hand, all of my pluses was to board, it was those soft pluses. I did manage to end up with 2 Grade 2s in Inferno that I could use for intercepts. However, these attacks are so much more larger than they were the turn prior because of all the soul that Ben was able to amass through the cyclers, and now we have double Narissa coming down onto the board, many Adelaides, and once again, I want to reiterate the fact that I misplayed in my guarding here. 3 Adelaides that will only breach 19k after the restand from the Vanguard swing. That first Adelaide should always be a no guard, because if you do get the defensive there, you effectively get to 0 card guard the next 2 Adelaides.
Yeah, the other thing to mention as well, in this particular board setup, is that I've only got 1 Pursuit on the board, and that's the card that you're going to be no-guarding, because it's currently sitting at 24 base on its own before, I restand it or whatever with any bodies on the board. And even though it's going to have a huge boost in the form of Narissa, so everything else is easy to guard. Sure, there's the Narissa on the Axel Circle, which is currently sitting at like 53k, but again, you're only on 2 damage, you have a massive damage lead, there are 2 to 3 attacks that you can comfortably afford to no-guard, and then spend a bunch of effort trying to guard everything else is probably the more reasonable investment.
Yeah,
we keep saying about how Jewel Knights has the ability to constantly recycle, go through its pieces, and what that means is that between drive checks, between your turning small units in hand into shield, you will eventually get to a position where your hand is mostly triggers or mostly 10k shields from bouncing Eunices or whatever, such that guarding is actually a lot easier than it would be in a lot of other decks, because you're not looking to keep combo pieces in hand. Because anything that's not a trigger, these grade 1s can turn themselves into attackers if you need them to.
Yeah. Force marker decks being force marker decks. So I want to point out that like this game as well, because I went second, because I didn't have the original Ashley in hand, I decided to go force 2. I was trying to go for like a one-shot because it's possible with Ashley Reverse. You're not limited to having a grade 3 in Soul to get the guard restrict. You're not limited to having a grade 3 in Soul to be able to do like the full lock superior call bullshit. So trying to basically re-wrench the tempo out of Ben's hand after that very strong grade 3 turn, I go to the Force 2 here. And what this means that if I get another rewrite into Ashley Reverse, I'm able to get Force 2 on both the Vanguard Circle and the Miranda that I call out, which would then copy the power of the Ashley Reverse. And Miranda being able to copy the power of the Ashley Reverse I get after the triple locks, that's going to be really hard to guard on Ben's side of things if he decided to expend a lot of cards from hand to guard the Ashley Reverse, period.
Yeah, it's also worth mentioning here that, even though this isn't full combo, I don't have the double wheel assaults, by being able to put trigger power on the Adelaides, these now hit over that defensive, and yeah, he doesn't have the ability to guard, and that really is what pushes it. And when you look, this is the sort of example of a game where Thavas high rolls, find all its pieces, and sort of steamrolls the opponent. But the thing to be aware of is that even in a game like that, the power envelopes are so thin and so small that it really is a war of attrition. You're looking for like these minute incremental advantages to really pull ahead with.
So in this clip here, we're fast forwarding where I get the first ride, I'm able to do some Ashley farming, and then I go straight into Ashley Reverse here. I get the crit, and this is basically, I think I wanted to use this as like a great demonstration to show what the upper ceiling of what Jewel Knights can do is. So Ben has 2 pursuits in their front as well as an Adelaide, so that's effectively 15k shield on the board, as well as potential really strong attackers on the next turn after. So Ashley's not once per turn skill to be able to just turn one of your units in hand into a new unit onto the board, but at the same time also pop one. Being able to pop one is what really makes Ashley Reverse really strong. Not being once per turn, being able to board wipe at the same time as being able to plus, that's that +2 that I'm talking about here.
Yeah, looking at the context of the wider meta game, it is not as useful against something like, say, Steam Maiden, which can keep their front row open, or perhaps even Luwad, which wants its front row units to die so that it can recycle them. And likewise with Thavas, it's the sort of deck where, again, because you're playing this war of attrition, this like death by 1,000 cuts, incremental advantages sort of game plan, against decks like Luwad, Steam Maiden, even Great Nature, you'll get into a position where those decks that try and throw out these haymakers, these massive advantage, big swingy plays, one of those will put themselves so far ahead of you that you'll have to work twice as hard to catch up. Whereas something like Jewel Knights, which has just one line of play and one big slam, it's going to be a lot easier for you to sort of control the tempo, as it were.
So, despite myself only having the 1 counterblast left, Miranda is a great addition to the Jewel Knight deck. We finally have an in-archetype countercharger here, so despite myself not using the Miranda effect this turn, as you'll see in the future, I'll actually just go ahead and just have her on board to be able to countercharge with. Herself being able to be there lets me have a new Miranda from deck, gain the power from the Ashley Reverse after the swing. So I've got 2 Force Marker here, so I was able to get the break ride, so my Ashley Reverse does have the crit here. And in a similar instance before, Ben is still only at 2 damage, but he wasn't able to get the multiple pursuits, wasn't able to get the multiple quarrels, and Eunice to be able to cycle into a more healthier hand, so he is forced to no guard on this swing as well.
Yeah, and again, the quote-unquote time bomb that is Jewel Knights means that my ability to safely no guard stops at 4, whereas his ability to safely no guard only stops at 5. And it's that sort of putting a leash on the game plan is another example of being able to wrestle control back from Thavas, being able to be in charge of the tempo of the game. And it's things like that that really makes the difference in this sort of matchup.
So as we see there, I was able to get a counter charge off of the Miranda, and we're going to do my direct here. I get a very nice heal. Not really needed, not really what I was looking at to go for the game here, but basically, like I said before, because of my aggressive soul charging that I did in the early game, I am being rewarded with triggers at this point. So I'm able to push Ben to 4 here, and though I don't believe I win here, or maybe I even win because Miranda is so huge, just that the one trigger that I believe I actually decided to put the trigger onto the rail, just in case of defensive triggers being able to hit over as well. Ben decides to take this one, and then at this point, this Miranda is also extremely large, but this pulls the PG and the heal as well.
Yeah, what it definitely does is that it cripples a lot of my incoming turn. You can see here that I've got no soul on the Thavas. My hand is not low, but not exactly healthy. And it's now that uphill struggle I was mentioning where he's got the board tempo, he's got the hand tempo, and he's got the advantage on damage as well. So he's fully in control of this game. And even though I've got a lot of really strong pieces like the Baragios, the Adelaide, and a Pursuit Assault to fight back with, he's now in the driver's seat in that he can choose what to guard and when. I need to find a bunch of triggers to really push threatening numbers. I've only got the one Wheel Assault, so I can't exactly make the best attacking columns. And we'll see that even though it's not... I didn't lose that turn, but I definitely fell behind in terms of overall game sense.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I think about VPremium in general is that in a lot of matchups and with a lot of decks, control of the tempo and control of the flow of the game can move back and forth quite a lot. But in the particular case of Thavas, I find that Thavas really struggles to deal with changes in tempo. Like if you start off winning, you stay winning. But the moment you start losing, it's really hard to stop losing without a bunch of triggers going your way.
Yeah, it really does depend on what kind of matchup you're up against. Like, I imagine if Astral Reverse did not have that retire skill, your pursuits would still be on the board. You could use then the Adelaides to guard with because they're not as strong attackers as pursuits or as corals. And basically, depending on what was in your hand, you would have like different guarding patterns because you would know these are certain cards that you want to keep on board. And basically, when you go up against these kind of matchups that actually do force you to guard strangely or force you to expend extra cards from hand or take unneeded damage because you are forced to keep certain cards in hand, such as extra copies of Pursuit in the future, extra copies of Corals in the future, it makes it harder for you to maintain that damage disparity that I'm able to do as Jewel Knights because everything in my hand can cycle, everything in my hand serves a purpose, similar to what we said for Gear Chronicle. Everything serves a purpose. A normal unit that I guard in the early game can be a normal unit I send back. A normal unit I call in the early game can be a normal unit I call over for a cycle. And it's kind of like this disparity in like card strengths in the early game and what they do for each deck and how important they are to stay on the board for each deck. That kind of shows a very strange narrative between Thavas and Jewel Knights, I want to say.
Yeah, that's totally valid. I will mention here, we almost forgot the triple drive, and that crit does really go a long way into evening out this game. But the double defensive here from you turns off pretty much all of my attacks from this point on.
Triple defensive.
Yeah, so that basically ends my turn. It just means that I'm just doing a bunch of attacks here just to get the value on the Coral Assaults.
Yeah.
But I've equalized on damage, and I've drawn a few extra cards. But again, the tempo is still entirely, the ball's entirely in your court. I've got some bodies for you to retire. I'm on 5 damage. I have to guard everything. I can't guard Vanguard swings because there's no Sentinels. And if I save up all the shield in my hand to guard the Vanguard swing, I then have to deal with the rear guard swings, which becomes a lot harder when I lose my intercepts.
Yeah. So we're going to basically see the same thing as last time. Once again, Ben does have 10k shield on the board through the double intercept, but with Astral Reverse, with all the soul that I've been able to farm, like cost of soul farm as well, I want to say, off of like all of these like overplay skills, on attack skills, I'm able to definitely have enough soul to be able to burn through his board, call new things, and you'll notice that the Astral Reverse I called to the back last turn just to lock is now acting as an attacker this turn. So, like I said, every piece can play a part on the board. Every piece can be locked, every piece can be guarded with, every piece can be called over. It's one of the beautiful things about Jewel Knights.
Yeah, and again, even though the grade 1 itself is only 8k, doesn't gain any power on its own, it still serves a purpose when you call over it. So when you replace it with an actual attacker later on in the turn, it's still refunded something, it's still gotten you closer to a trigger maybe, and it's this sort of high flexibility, and well, flexibility is not quite the right term, it's more inevitability, where every single card, everything you do in Jewel Knights gets you closer and closer to this one win con, which is really big Ashley Reverse.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that sort of focus is the word that Thavas lacks in a way, and is why I think Jewel Knights is probably high tier 2, low tier 1. So again, I'm really surprised that we haven't seen more of Jewel Knights in the current BCS season, and I reckon that because of how uninteractive and how straightforward Jewel Knights is, there is a chance that we might see a few of them come up at Worlds, even though it's got a pretty 50-50 matchup against Steam Maidens. Well, as far as a 50-50 matchup against the tier 1 deck can go, it has a reasonable matchup into Steam Maidens, but has a really, in my opinion, a really good matchup into everything else.
Everything else, yeah. And yeah, just like you said, I was able to, despite Morbius not being a great attacker herself, I found another attacker off of Ashley Reverse's skill to call over the Morbius, which let me draw a card, and I just happened to draw into Ashley. So Ashley Reverse, despite not having an overcall skill, Ashley does, and if, just in case that Ben would be able to get a 6-7 damage heal trigger, I now have the option of actually being able to call a new Miranda over that new Ashley I just called to give the Miranda a crit. So I'd have crit pressure from the drive checks on the Ashley Reverse column, and then I also have crit pressure as well as the really large Miranda that had just been superior called, and now will gain the same buffs that Ashley Reverse did.
Yeah. So jumping into our final example, one of our last games, here we've had a bit more of a back and forth. You can see that we're both on fairly low damage. I've still set up a lot of combo, not the perfect combo, but most of them. And here we're going to see that the weakness, we talked about the weaknesses of Thavas, its limitations. Here we're going to look at maybe the weaknesses of Jewel Knights in that it needs a few things to go right, and it does need to find some pieces which it can do better than Thavas, but still needs to get through. And here we see you're taking a lot of damage because you don't have as many cards in hand, and what few cards you do have in hand you need to hold on to for your oncoming turn, and this really affects your guarding ability.
Yeah, it affects my guarding ability a lot. So this basically shows that sometimes if you don't have that good grade 1, grade 2 ride, like sometimes if you don't get that Sybil ride over for that +1 to board, you only get like the rail ride over, your plussing actually isn't that much, and your hand does get stifled. As you can see here, I'm forced to guard in awkward places. But I believe one of the main things I wanted to show off on this clip is how good the Jewel Knight comeback mechanic is. Ashley Reverse can chain into a full board and can chain nothing into something. And I'm hoping that this is what is going to get showed off here.
Yeah, huge trigger coming in here. Being able to put a crit on that fairly large Pursuit Assault means that even though you're at 4 damage here and you're guarding the Vanguard swing safely, that's now an extra attack that you have to guard. Yeah. Whereas before, it would have been one of the 2 attacks that you could have no-guarded.
Yeah. So I'm actually choosing to put the crit in the back row because that back row one is the one that's going to jump into the axle marker to gain that extra 5k, making it just a little bit harder to guard. And that extra 5k, it does come up big sometimes.
Yeah, so between the Coral that stood, between the Adelaide that's about to restand, I am spoiled for choice on attackers here. And it is definitely, I am at this point still thinking that, I'm committing aggressively, I've got all my pieces going in, but I am still afraid that those 3 or 4 cards that you're holding onto for dear life in your hand, one of them is definitely an Ashley Reverse. I'm on 3 damage. I don't actually have a PG in hand at this point, I do remember this much, which means that if you do go into the Ashley Reverse, I am facing lethal on the board.
Mm-hmm. And I think another thing to mention as well, as compared to one of the prior examples we did where you were able to get all the Corals and the Narissas, you got a lot of cycle out, which means you had a lot of healthier hand at the end of turn. At the end of this turn, you're only going to be drawing 2. One off the extra axle marker and one off that Coral Assault. That if you decide to cycle it out, which I do believe you do, because 5k on board, that's bound to get sniped by an Ashley Reverse, you may as well convert it into a guarding hand. But even with that, that's just not as much hand as you would have if you were able to call down the Narissas and such. And as you see here, I'm down to my last card in hand. I was able to guard the Pursuit Assault with the crit, with my own crit Sentinel, and we're gonna go ahead and pass it back to my turn. 1 card left in hand, and that is the Ashley Reverse, just like what you predicted. Funnily enough, the card I drew was a heal trigger, but what's important to see here is that off of that Ashley Reverse reride and off of 1 card in hand, I am able to basically pull the game back because of the way that Ashley Reverse is able to just crank out soft advantage. But on a final turn, soft advantage is all you need.
Yeah, definitely. So we see here, I've got 6, maybe 7 cards in hand. Like I said, none of them are a PG. None of them are I don't have a way of guarding the Melissa. So it's going to be a huge struggle for me to guard all the rear guard attacks. And I just have to pray that he doesn't find a crit on his Vanguard swing.
So I'm able to find a Morbidus, not the best one, but because I did soak up so much damage, I'm happy to use her skill to counterblast 1, cycle back, but get the soul. And with that 1 extra soul I get from the Morbidus, that is the extra soul that I needed, I would need 1 more soul, and I do believe that I actually find an all Wayne off of this next Ashley skill. So I'm gonna go ahead and Soul Blast 2 again. You could argue that maybe it would be safer for me to go ahead and counterblast 1 more time, just to ensure that I do have all the soul needed. But I do find the all Wayne off of this as well. Off of all Wayne skills, I'm going to get that 1 last missing soul to get all of the 3 lock that I need to be able to get the Sentinel Restrict, as well as just on swing, call over, get all the bodies that I need to attack with, have that really large crit pressure, Vanguard, Guard Restrict, 60-70k going at Ben's head, and all I need to do is find that crit trigger. Off the top 4 here, I think what happened was I found an original Ashley. And so my idea was, with the counterblast that I have left, I could call the Miranda over that initial Ashley again, and then that way, if Ben just doesn't have a crit trigger, I can donate the crit to Miranda, and that'll be 2 lethal swings going at Ben's head.
Yeah, knowing this, I got the Ashley swing, and I know that the Miranda that he eventually puts on the Ashley circle will have the crit as well. So it does again come down to, if he doesn't drive a crit, I'm okay here because I go to 5. And then even though that Miranda's gonna have a crit, I should theoretically maybe still be able to guard it, but it is, like I said, still an uphill battle.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that, again, just highlighting the fact that he went from 0, like 1 or 2 damage, to 5 with 1 card left in hand because of his inability to find all of his pieces and really dig that deep in the early game. The weakness, it is a weakness of the deck, but it's not crippling in the way that Thavas is crippled if you need to find your draw pieces and you don't find them, or you need to find Pursuit Assaults and Adelaides and you don't find them.
Yeah, so basically this is more to showcase that Ashley Reverse is a great comeback mechanic. You can go from nothing to something with Ashley Reverse, but in Thavas' case, if you don't find Pursuit Assault in the early game, or if you don't find an Adelaide in the early game, you're snookered. You don't have the condition to stride into Lambros from the main deck, and that really slows down your deck because you don't get that extra drive check for that pressure, you don't get the extra rewrite for the Axel Circle, you don't get Pursuit Assault for the draw that it has, and that kind of stuff just keeps adding up and up. So that's going to be it for this episode of Matchup Dissected Title Pending. This time we, rather than looked at like the upper echelon of the VPremium format, we kind of looked at the more unspoken hero, so to say. Thavas, as Ben said, was a deck that performed really well in the Springfest season, getting many tops, and that's because of the release of Pursuit Assault, which is a very good card, as well as the release of Adelaide. But that's not to throw shade at all to Jewel Knights, which managed to get 3 out of 4 of the new sets supporting them. Being able to get like a full suite of support, this deck is pretty much four of Jewel Knights everywhere, and you have 1 flex slot. Could be another Jewel Knight in Salome. I chose the Sis list in my list to be able to find the Ashley Reverses, which I do believe is the powerhouse of the deck. Having a full set of support can make your deck good. Who would have thought?
Yep, as I said, Thavas is a deck that's tried and tested, well known in the meta. But at this point, one of the reasons that it's maybe quote-unquote falling off a little bit is just that inability to really do that one thing and hit it with a sledgehammer. It is still a decent deck, but we can see that when looking at Clan Collection, it is maybe falling behind a little bit, compared to the likes of Jewel Knights and Gear Chronicle and whatnot. But again, hopefully we'll see it come with Resurgence. But yeah, that's going to be it for this episode. Once again, as always, do the regular things of liking, subscribing, bell icon, set up to the channel. We have a few more episodes focusing on VPremium in the pipeline, but continue to let us know about any matchups you want to take a look at, any formats. We will look at Standard and Premium at some point, so give us a shout if there are any decks you want us to look at, any particular matchups you want to see. We will get around to it, but until then, we'll see you all next time.